The dog was still in the truck, starving, but alive. Bobby, Sheila, and their 6-year-old daughter Madison had been gone for days. No note, no phone, no trace of where they went or why. $32,000 in cash sat untouched on the seat beside where the dog had been waiting. Investigators searched the mountains. They found nothing. 4 years later, they found the bones, and that only made it worse.
In October 2009. They had told locals in the town of Eufaula that they were heading into the mountains to look at a 40-acre plot of land.
A real estate inquiry?
Yeah, but when they didn't return, the alarm was raised and the truck was found days later. I was looking through the crime scene photography and the initial police reports. The sheer presence of that $32,000 in cash seems to immediately short-circuit any conventional theory of a crime of opportunity.
It absolutely eliminates the most statistically probable scenario, which is robbery. In criminal profiling, a financially motivated offender simply does not leave behind a fortune in bundled cash sitting in plain sight.
Especially when they have already committed to a crime as severe as kidnapping or murder.
Exactly. The risk-to-reward ratio for the perpetrator is completely skewed if the reward is left on the passenger seat.
But wait, if we pivot to the other common theory, that they willingly walked away to start a new life, the inventory of that truck makes even less sense.
It makes no sense at all.
If you are orchestrating a disappearance to start over, the cash is the very first thing you take. And you certainly don't leave behind your essential identification and your communication devices.
Which leaves us analyzing the immediate physical terrain for answers. The truck was parked on a dirt road surrounded by rough, forested terrain, soft earth, undergrowth, and loose shale.
And from a tracking perspective,
An environment like an autumnal forest bed is highly impressionable. Law enforcement brought in experienced trackers, expecting to find trace evidence. Footprints indicating a direction of travel, broken branches, or drag marks indicating violence.
and the reports indicate they found zero trace evidence. How is it physically possible for 3 human beings to move through soft dirt and dense brush without leaving a single directional indicator?
It is incredibly rare, and it speaks to a very specific set of conditions. Either they walked exclusively along the hard-packed gravel of the main road for miles before entering the brush,
Which is unlikely given the remote location.
very unlikely, or they were intercepted immediately at the vehicle and placed into another vehicle. But again, that brings us back to the untouched cash.
Right, the money.
The lack of trace evidence suggests a highly controlled abstraction, yet the undisturbed money suggests a chaotic or interrupted one. It is a profound contradiction.
To understand how they ended up on that mountain, we really have to rewind the timeline and analyze the psychological pressure cooker they were living in back in Eufaula.
The domestic situation.
Yeah. On paper, they were an ordinary family. Bobby worked odd jobs, and Sheila was a dedicated mother to Madison. But the investigative notes from the weeks leading up to the trip reveal some severe behavioral shifts.
Significant red flags.
I noticed in the financial records that Bobby made a very quiet, very significant increase to his life insurance policy shortly before they left.
That financial anomaly is a critical data point. A sudden, unexplained increase in a life insurance policy often serves as a red flag for either suicidal ideation or a genuine fear for one's life.
And when you pair that financial move with a documented familial tension, the profile of the household becomes deeply unstable. Bobby was involved in a bitter, escalating, and legally complex dispute with his own father over property and gas royalties.
Yes, the lawsuit.
I read through the summaries of those disputes, and it wasn't just a mild disagreement, it was intensely hostile. It involved threats and deep-seated paranoia, and this tension clearly began to manifest in their daily interactions.
It spilled over into the community.
It did. The family pastor was interviewed by investigators, and he described a growing sense of dread regarding their behavior, though he couldn't articulate a specific threat.
That unnamed dread from the pastor is given context when we look at the physical evidence recovered from the Jamison home, specifically Sheila's journal.
The journal entries are chilling.
The investigators cataloged pages of writings focused on what she termed spiritual warfare. The entries detail a profound sense of persecution, a belief that an unseen darkness was pressing in on the family, and a hyperfixation on protective measures against external forces.
Does clinical psychology differentiate between intense religious expression and genuine psychological crisis in a case like this? Because Oklahoma has communities where language about spiritual warfare is just part of the standard religious vernacular.
It is a vital distinction to make. The use of the term spiritual warfare alone is not inherently indicative of pathology. However, forensic psychologists look for clusters of behavior.
And we have more than just the writing.
Exactly. In this case, we don't just have the journal entries, we have corroborating witness statements from neighbors noting that Bobby had become increasingly withdrawn, pacing the property, and acting as if he were monitoring threats that no one else could perceive.
So it's the combination of factors.
Yes. When religious ideology transitions into acute isolation, paranoia, and a pervasive fear of physical harm from invisible entities, it crosses the threshold from faith into a severe psychological crisis.
Which brings us to the most debated piece of evidence in the entire case file: the home security footage from October 8th, the day they were packing the truck for the mountains.
That video is difficult to watch.
I have watched the breakdown of this video, and it is deeply unsettling. The footage shows Bobby and Sheila making repeated trips back and forth from the house to the truck, loading unknown items. But it's their body language that investigators fixated on.
The physical movements captured on that camera have been analyzed by numerous behavioral experts. They are observed loading the vehicle over the course of several hours, but they do not speak, they do not pause to interact, and they move with a distinctly mechanical, almost robotic focus.
And we should note, they left the house unlocked, with another pet dog left starving inside the home.
A completely irrational decision for people who loved their pets.
You mentioned earlier that the psychological evaluation pointed toward a potential shared crisis. The term folie à deux comes up frequently in the source material regarding this footage.
Yeah.
Can you explain what that actually means in a clinical sense and how it applies to what we see on the screen?
Folie à deux, or shared psychotic disorder, is a rare psychiatric syndrome where a delusion is transmitted from one individual to another.
Like a contagion.
Essentially, yes. It typically occurs in a deeply isolated environment where a dominant partner experiences a break from reality, perhaps induced by immense stress, financial ruin, or even substance use, and the secondary partner, due to their isolation and dependence, adopts that same delusional framework.
So the video could be capturing that state.
If the Jamisons were experiencing this, the blank, robotic movements could be the physical manifestation of two people operating within a shared, deeply internalized hallucination or panic state, completely detached from their actual surroundings.
But hold on, how common is it really for two adults to simultaneously experience a break from reality that aligns that perfectly? Doesn't a deliberate, planned action make more sense looking at the video?
It's a valid argument.
If they are methodically carrying items for hours, that implies a task-oriented focus, not necessarily a dissociative state.
That is the exact friction point that divides analysts. Shared psychotic disorders are exceedingly rare. The alternative theory, deliberateness, argues that we are watching two people who know exactly what they're doing.
Preparing for something specific.
Right. The mechanical nature of their movements might not be dissociation, but rather deep, calculated focus under immense stress.
And that leads to the great mystery of the footage: the unknown boxes. The video clearly shows them loading several brown boxes or containers into the truck.
Handfuls of items over several hours.
Yet when law enforcement recovered the vehicle on the mountain, those boxes were entirely missing. They were not in the truck, and they were never found in the surrounding woods.
The absence of those boxes is the central missing variable. If we assume deliberateness, whatever was in those containers was the entire purpose of the trip.
And whatever it was, it's gone.
The fact that they vanished alongside the family suggests they were either hidden by the Jamisons themselves, or they were taken by an unknown third party who deemed the contents of those boxes far more valuable than the $32,000 in cash left behind.
Let's shift the timeline forward to the fracture point of the investigation. After the truck was found in 2009, search and rescue teams combed that rugged terrain for weeks using ground crews, aircraft, and cadaver dogs.
A massive operation.
The search yielded nothing, and the case went cold until November 16, 2013, 4 years later. A deer hunter navigating a remote area of the Bois Mountains stumbled across human skeletal remains. They were recovered, tested, and identified as Bobby, Sheila, and Madison.
The location of that recovery is one of the most frustrating details for law enforcement. The remains were found less than 3 miles from where the truck had been abandoned.
How does a massive, multi-agency search grid, equipped with trained dogs, completely miss 3 individuals who were essentially just a few miles down the road?
It speaks to the extreme limitations of search and rescue operations in untamed environments. A 3-mile radius in a dense mountainous forest is not the same as a 3-mile radius in a suburb.
The terrain works against you.
Completely. The topography features deep ravines, thick canopy cover that obscures aerial views, and dense underbrush that restricts sightlines to mere feet. Furthermore, the effectiveness of cadaver dogs is heavily dependent on weather conditions.
Like the wind.
Wind currents, humidity, and temperature all affect how a scent tone travels. If the remains were in a localized depression, or if the wind was pushing the scent away from the search grid, the dogs would simply walk right past the area.
So after 4 years of waiting, investigators finally possessed the physical remains of the victims. You would expect modern forensic science to step in and provide a definitive answer as to how they died. But when the medical examiner concluded their thorough examination, the official ruling for the cause of death was inconclusive.
To understand why the medical examiner had to make that ruling, we have to look at the science of forensic taphonomy, which is the study of how organisms decay over time.
Because of the 4-year gap.
Precisely. After 4 years of exposure to the extreme weather of the Oklahoma mountains and local wildlife, the remains were entirely skeletal.
Meaning all the soft tissue evidence was gone.
Soft tissue is what holds the most common indicators of cause of death. You cannot test for toxicology to see if drugs or poisons were involved. You cannot find defensive wounds, stab marks, or evidence of strangulation.
It's all erased by time.
By the time the remains were recovered, the forensic anthropologist was strictly looking for skeletal trauma. A bullet nicking a rib, a skull fracture from blunt force, or a bone break indicating a fall. The examination found absolutely none of those things.
Nothing at all.
Without skeletal trauma and without soft tissue, the scientific method demands an inconclusive ruling. The medical examiner cannot guess. They can only state what the physical evidence proves, which, in this case, was nothing.
This leaves us with an unresolved reality that forces us to synthesize a lot of dead ends. The Jamison file remains open. There is a very mundane theory that attempts to ground this case. It argues that a family buckling under intense financial strain, a bitter familial lawsuit, and severe psychological pressure, perhaps exacerbated by the isolation of their environment, simply drove into the wilderness, suffered a collective breakdown, became lost, and succumbed to the elements.
As an analyst, you have to acknowledge that theory, but you also have to subject it to the evidence.
And it falls apart.
The mundane theory completely fails to account for the physical data. It does not explain the mechanical, silent loading of unknown boxes for hours on security footage. It does not explain why a family in deep financial distress would abandon $32,000 on the front seat of a truck.
Or the dog.
Exactly. And it struggles to explain how 3 people succumbed to the elements together without leaving a single conclusive mark on their remains or a traceable path in the dirt.
It is a sobering reminder of the true fragility of human life and the limitations of modern science. We are accustomed to a world where technology, security footage, and forensic reconstruction neatly resolve our tragedies and answer our questions. The Jamison case dismantles that comfort.
It does. It forces you to confront the reality that sometimes a sequence of events can leave behind a trail of evidence that simply will not form a complete, rational picture.
Madison Jamison was just 6 years old when she walked into those woods, and the mountains have kept the secret of what happened to her and her parents.
It leaves investigators and analysts continually returning to the source material, looking for the one variable that might suddenly make the conflicting data points align.
And as we close this deep dive, there is one final strange detail from the investigative files that you should mull over on your own. When law enforcement powered up the GPS device found inside the abandoned truck, they checked the final coordinate that had been plugged into the system.
The destination point.
Right. The Jamisons had told everyone they were going to look at a prime 40-acre plot of land for sale. But the final waypoint logged into their GPS did not point to the boundaries of that property.
Not even close.
It pointed to a specific barren ridge deep in the woods, miles away from the real estate they were supposed to be viewing. Why did Bobby or Sheila program those specific, isolated coordinates into their device? And more importantly, who or what were they expecting to meet when they got there?